In 1990, audiences witnessed something utterly bizarre. A superhero film that wasn't based on a comic book, wasn't backed by a major franchise, and wasn't afraid to be ugly, violent, and deeply unsettling. Sam Raimi's Darkman wasn't your clean-cut Batman or Superman. It was a scarred, vengeful anti-hero with rage boiling beneath his melted skin. It was a film stitched together from horror, pulp, and comic book DNA, and against all odds, it became a cult classic. But behind the camera, chaos, battles with the studio, and insane creative choices that could have destroyed the movie. Today, we're diving into 20 shocking facts about Darkman that will leave you stunned. 1. Sam Raimi's superhero that Hollywood never wanted. Sam Raimi had just scored big with Evil Dead 2, and while studios saw him as the quirky horror guy, Raimi had bigger ambitions. He wanted to make a superhero movie. He first tried to secure rights to Batman and The Shadow, but was flatly rejected. So, in true Raimi fashion, he decided to create his own hero, stitching together pulp and horror influences into Peyton Westlake, a scientist turned grotesque vigilante after being brutally scarred. Universal agreed to back the project, expecting something glossy and mainstream like Batman. But what they got instead was a violent, R-rated fever dream. Raimi fought to keep his twisted vision alive, and the result was a one-of-a-kind anti-hero film that helped lay the groundwork for the darker superhero stories of later decades. 2. The Shadow That Never Was. Raimi's first real dream wasn't Darkman, but an adaptation of The Shadow, a pulp vigilante who prowled in the dark with his fedora and cape. When he failed to get the rights, he created his own version, Darkman, who borrowed heavily from the pulp hero, but took a far more tragic and monstrous form. Instead of the slick, mysterious crime fighter, Raimi delivered Peyton Westlake, a man wrapped in bandages, mentally unstable, and driven by rage. Ironically, Hollywood would later release a Shadow movie in 1994 starring Alec Baldwin, which flopped and was quickly forgotten, while Raimi's failed attempt to make The Shadow endured as a cult classic. In the end, Raimi's disappointment gave birth to something far more original and lasting. 3. A Frankenstein Batman hybrid. Hero emerges. Raimi often described Darkman as Frankenstein meets Batman, and the comparison couldn't be more fitting. Like Frankenstein's monster, Peyton Westlake is a tragic outcast, scarred and feared by society, yet still clinging to humanity. Like Batman, he wages a one-man war on crime, though his methods are far more unstable and violent. His invention of synthetic skin, capable of replicating any face but only lasting 99 minutes, allowed him to infiltrate criminal gangs while constantly battling the ticking clock of his disguise. This curse gave him both power and tragedy. He could taste normalcy, but never keep it. Unlike Batman's cold calculation, Darkman was a volatile, rage-filled creation, a prototype for the unstable, flawed anti-heroes who would dominate future cinema. 4. Liam Neeson's brutal transformation under the mask. When Universal rejected Raimi's first choice of Bruce Campbell, they landed on Liam Neeson, then a rising actor but far from the household name he'd later become. For Neeson, Darkman was torture. He endured up to 18-hour days in prosthetic makeup, suffocating under latex burns and masks while performing grueling night shoots and emotional breakdowns in sweltering studio lights. Yet, despite the punishing conditions, Neeson delivered a powerhouse performance, balancing Peyton's broken humanity with Darkman's uncontrollable fury. Raimi later admitted Neeson's emotional depth held the film together, giving a grotesque concept genuine heart. And in a strange twist of fate, the role foreshadowed Neeson's later reinvention as a hardened action hero, from Schindler's List to Taken, all beginning with his tragic turn in Darkman. 5. 99 Minutes to Madness. The synthetic skin curse. The defining gimmick of Darkman was Peyton's invention of synthetic skin. a revolutionary formula that allowed him to replicate any human face with eerie precision, but only for 99 minutes in light, before melting away. This wasn't just a clever sci-fi device, it was a metaphor for Peyton's life. Every chance at normalcy came with a ticking clock, and every disguise was a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. Raimi turned this weakness into horror, staging grotesque scenes where masks bubbled and peeled off, or disguises failed mid-mission. Unlike gimmicky vulnerabilities like kryptonite, Darkman's flaw was deeply personal. It wasn't about defeating villains, but about never escaping his own torment. The 99-minute curse gave the film its identity, painting Darkman as a tragic figure racing against both time and his own inner demons. 6. The Studio War. Universal, Raimi. Universal Studios thought they were funding a dark superhero movie in the wake of Tim Burton's Batman. But what Raimi delivered was far weirder, bloodier, and more grotesque than the studio had anticipated. Executives hated the early cuts and even tried to wrest control from Raimi by bringing in their own editors, who butchered the film into bland versions that tested poorly with audiences. Raimi and his team secretly re-edited the movie back into the version he wanted, defying Universal's authority. In the end, the studio had little choice but to release Raimi's vision. Ironically, it turned into a sleeper hit, making nearly $50 million on a $16 million budget and proving that Raimi's wild instincts were right all along. 7. Danny Elfman's score that screamed horror opera. No Raimi film is complete without bombastic music, and for Darkman, he landed the legendary Danny Elfman, fresh off his Batman triumph. But instead of simply repeating the dark, gothic superhero sound, Elfman leaned into his horror sensibilities, crafting a score that felt like a twisted opera of tragedy and rage. The swelling strings and eerie crescendos gave Darkman the feel of a monster movie from the 1930s, with echoes of Phantom of the Opera and Frankenstein. It elevated the film beyond pulp into something theatrical and mythic, amplifying the grotesque visuals with haunting elegance. Without Elfman's music, Darkman might have felt like a messy B-movie, but with it, the film sang, literally, like a horror opera disguised as a superhero flick. 8. Bruce Campbell. Almost the Darkman we never got. Sam Raimi originally wanted his longtime friend and Evil Dead star Bruce Campbell to play Peyton Westlake. Campbell had the right mix of tragic gravitas and zany intensity that Raimi envisioned. But Universal wasn't convinced. They wanted a more serious actor to lead what they hoped would be a blockbuster. Campbell was sidelined, but Raimi still found a way to sneak him in. He appears in the final scene of Darkman as one of Peyton's disguises, effectively becoming the final face of the hero. Fans still debate whether Campbell would have been an even better Darkman, but his cameo is Raimi's sly way of saying, "This is the Darkman I wanted all along." 9. The helicopter scene that nearly killed the crew. One of Darkman's most jaw-dropping sequences involves Peyton dangling from a helicopter, smashing through buildings and traffic as he clings to a rope. Long before CGI shortcuts, Raimi pushed for practical stunts, meaning real helicopters, real city streets, and real danger. The scene was notoriously difficult to film, with stunt performers risking their lives in high winds and cramped airspace. At one point, safety concerns nearly shut down production, but Raimi insisted the shot would become the movie's defining spectacle. He was right. The helicopter chase remains one of the film's most iconic action set pieces. Behind the chaos, however, was the terrifying truth. One wrong move, and the stunt team could have faced disaster. 10. The makeup chair. Neeson's 18-hour daily nightmare. To transform Liam Neeson into Darkman required one of the most grueling prosthetic processes in Hollywood at the time. Makeup artists spent up to 18 hours layering burns, scars, and deformities across Neeson's face, leaving him trapped in latex for entire days of shooting. The The process was so extreme that Neeson reportedly had little time left for sleep, often going from the chair straight onto set for night shoots. The prosthetics were heavy, itchy, and suffocating under studio lights, yet Neeson delivered raw, emotional performances through the mask. His dedication gave Peyton Westlake both a horrifying appearance and a soul. The pain behind the makeup bled into the character, making Darkman's torment feel brutally real on screen. 11. Robert Durant, the crime lord who stole the show. While Peyton Westlake is the tragic hero of Darkman, the film's true scene stealer is villain Robert Durant, played with icy menace by Larry Drake. Durant wasn't just another mob boss. He was a sadistic kingpin who collected fingers as trophies, calmly clipping them with his cigar cutter while chatting like a businessman. Drake's chillingly casual performance gave the movie a villain as memorable as its hero, calculating, cruel, yet disturbingly charismatic. Raimi knew Durant needed to be larger than life, someone terrifying enough to justify Peyton's descent into madness. The helicopter chase, the explosions, the brutal fights, all were elevated by Durant's ruthless presence. So popular was Drake's villain that, despite dying in the first film, Universal brought him back for Darkman II, The Return of Durant. His resurrection stretched believability, but audiences didn't care. Durant had become a cult icon in his own right, a symbol of Raimi's ability to craft villains as unforgettable as heroes. Without Durant, Darkman's war would have lacked its sharpest edge, and the franchise would have missed its most enduring bad guy. 12. Dark comedy meets horror, Raimi's signature blend. Sam Raimi had always walked the fine line between horror and slapstick comedy, and Darkman was no exception. Amidst the violence and tragedy, Raimi infused moments of dark humor that felt straight out of a twisted comic book. Scenes of Peyton's uncontrollable rage, where his emotions explode in over-the-top bursts of screaming, teeter between terrifying and absurd. His grotesque disguises allow him to infiltrate criminals, but they also create absurd situations where thugs argue with themselves because Peyton is impersonating them. Raimi used exaggerated camera angles, quick zooms, and surreal editing to inject his trademark chaos into what could have been a straightforward revenge story. Critics at the time didn't always know what to make of this bizarre tone shift. Was it horror, comedy, tragedy, or pulp superhero? The answer was simple. It was all of them at once. This mashup became Raimi's calling card, later influencing Spider-Man with its goofy sincerity and manic energy. Darkman showed that a superhero movie didn't have to be self-serious to be powerful. It could be violent, tragic, and hilarious in equal measure, a blend only Raimi could pull off. 13. How Darkman became an accidental cult icon. When Darkman released in 1990, no one expected it to become a cultural phenomenon. Critics were divided, audiences weren't sure what to make of it, and Universal had little faith in its success. But something strange happened. Word of mouth spread, and audiences latched onto its bizarre mix of pulp, horror, and superhero tropes. By grossing nearly $50 million on a modest $16 million budget, it became a sleeper hit, paving the way for sequels, comic adaptations, and even video games. What made Darkman an accidental cult icon was its uniqueness. It wasn't based on a comic, yet it felt like one. It wasn't a horror film, yet it terrified. It wasn't a comedy, yet audiences laughed. Its grotesque hero, scarred and tragic, tapped into something more primal than the polished superheroes of the time. Fans who discovered it on VHS or late-night TV embraced its oddness, and slowly, Darkman carved out its own space in cult cinema. Today, it stands shoulder to shoulder with films like The Crow and Spawn as a darker, more eccentric take on heroism, one that still resonates with fans of the weird and unconventional. 14. Sequels without Raimi. The rise of direct-to-video chaos, success always spawns sequels, and Universal wasn't about to let Darkman's modest box office victory go without milking it. But Sam Raimi was gone, moving on to bigger projects, and Liam Neeson had no interest in reprising his role. Enter the era of direct-to-video chaos. Darkman II, The Return of Durant, and Darkman III, Die Darkman. Die arrived in the mid-1990s, with Arnold Vosloo stepping in as Peyton Westlake. These films lacked Raimi's manic energy, but leaned into pulpy, action-packed storytelling. Shot back-to-back on lower budgets, they kept the franchise alive, albeit in a scaled-down form. Fans of the original often dismissed them as inferior, but for B-movie lovers, they offered enough explosions, disguises, and cheesy one-liners to be enjoyable. Durant's improbable return in the second film provided continuity, while the third explored new villains and even a twisted love story. While not masterpieces, the sequels proved Darkman had enough cult power to sustain a mini-franchise, something few R-rated superhero experiments of the time could claim. They were messy, campy, and far from Raimi's vision. But in their own way, they kept the Darkman mythos alive. 15. Arnold Vosloo's unexpectedly brilliant replacement. When Universal announced that Arnold Vosloo would replace Liam Neeson as Peyton Westlake in the sequels, fans were skeptical. Vosloo, best known at the time for his genre work in smaller films, had massive shoes to fill. But against all odds, he pulled it off. Vosloo didn't try to mimic Neeson's performance. Instead, he leaned into the tragedy of Peyton, portraying him with a quiet intensity that fit the lower-budget productions. While the sequels lacked Raimi's wild stylistic flourishes, Vosloo gave them an emotional anchor, keeping Peyton sympathetic and compelling. His physicality worked well for the action-heavy scripts, and his mournful eyes carried the pain of a man cursed by his own brilliance. Fans of the Mummy series later recognized Vosloo as the villainous Imhotep, but long before that, he was the man who gave Darkman a second life. Though the sequels never reached the cult status of the original, Vosloo's turn as Peyton Westlake ensured they weren't forgotten. In the end, his performance proved that even without Neeson or Raimi, Darkman could endure. 16. Darkman vs. Ash, the comic book crossover nobody saw coming. By the mid-2000s, the Darkman film franchise was dead, but comic books kept his legacy alive. In 2006, Dynamite Entertainment released a 4-issue crossover event that blew fans' minds. Darkman vs. Army of Darkness. Yes, Sam Raimi's two tortured anti-heroes collided in one gloriously twisted pulp story. The plot picked up after Darkman III, with Peyton still battling criminals while trying to refine his synthetic skin. But things got insane when Julie accidentally unleashed the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, summoning Deadites into the city and transforming her into the Queen of Darkness. Enter Ash Williams, Raimi's chainsaw-wielding, wisecracking hero from Evil Dead. The clash of tones, Ash's absurd comedy versus Darkman's tragic rage, was both hilarious and brutal. The comic gave fans the Raimi crossover they never got on film, uniting two cult icons in a bloody, chaotic romp. For many, it was proof that Darkman still had a place in pop culture, even outside cinema. 17. The Raimi DNA that later shaped Spider-Man. If Darkman feels like a prototype for Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, that's because it was. Raimi experimented with stylized comic book framing, tragic romance, and the struggles of a flawed hero, all of which would later define Spider-Man. Peyton's bursts of uncontrollable rage foreshadow Peter Parker's darker moments, while his double life echoed the tension between Peter and Spider-Man. Even the camera flourishes, wild zooms, kinetic angles, and surreal montages were polished in Darkman before finding mainstream success in Spider-Man. Without Darkman, It's hard to imagine Raimi having the confidence to take on Marvel's flagship hero. In a strange way, Peyton Westlake paved the path for Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, proving that audiences could root for a flawed, tragic, and even goofy superhero. 18. The secret illegal edit that saved the movie. Few people know that Darkman nearly died in the editing room. Universal hated Raimi's early cut and replaced him with studio editors who reshaped the movie into bland, incoherent versions. Test audiences hated them. Desperate, Raimi's trusted editor, Bob Murawski, and team secretly re-edited the film without the studio's permission, restoring Raimi's surreal flourishes, grotesque humor, and gothic pacing. When Universal discovered this illegal cut, it was too late. Test audiences loved it, and the studio begrudgingly released Raimi's version. Had this backroom rebellion not happened, Darkman might have been released as a neutered mess and forgotten. Instead, it became a cult classic, all thanks to a rogue edit that defied Hollywood protocol. 19. Why Darkman was Marvel before. Marvel was cool. Long before the Marvel Cinematic Universe redefined superheroes, Darkman showed that audiences could embrace flawed, human, and even grotesque heroes. Peyton wasn't invincible. He was scarred, unstable, and tragic. But that vulnerability made him relatable, like Tony Stark or Peter Parker. He was a genius cursed by his own flaws, fighting personal demons as much as villains. Raimi even injected the light-hearted goofiness that Marvel would later perfect, balancing over-the-top action with absurd humor. In many ways, Darkman anticipated the formula that made Marvel films global juggernauts. A flawed hero, a mix of comedy and tragedy, and a self-aware embrace of pulp roots. Though not a Marvel character, Peyton Westlake feels like the prototype for the MCU's brand of flawed but fun heroes. 20. The future that never happened. Darkman's lost legacy. For all its cult success, Darkman never got the cinematic legacy it deserved. The sequels fizzled, the comics faded, and talk of a reboot has floated around Hollywood for years without ever materializing. Raimi has occasionally teased interest in revisiting the character, and Liam Neeson once joked he'd still be willing to don the bandages again. Fans dream of a gritty revival, perhaps on streaming, where darker superhero stories thrive. But for now, Peyton Westlake remains a relic of 1990, a scarred figure stalking the shadows of cult cinema. His story feels unfinished, his legacy muted, but maybe that's fitting. Darkman was never meant to be mainstream. He was always the outsider, the anti-hero who didn't fit in, both on screen and in Hollywood history. Darkman wasn't just another superhero flick. It was a Frankenstein creation of pulp, horror, tragedy, and comic book energy that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. It gave us a scarred anti-hero decades ahead of his time, villains as memorable as the hero, and a cult franchise that refuses to be forgotten. From Raimi's secret edits to Liam Neeson's grueling transformation, the story behind Darkman is as wild as the film itself. What do you think? Should Darkman rise again, or is he best left as a cult legend?